between regulators and locusts. So the thing is, you can't use pesticide on the regulators. And this old farmer leaned back, he said, "One bet." We have seen regulators descend like locusts on small businesses, killing jobs all across this country. And the simplest and most important regulatory reform, we need to repeal every word of Obamacare. The second key to reigniting the promise of America is defend our constitutional rights. All of them. We need to defend the First Amendment, our free speech, our religious liberty. All of us, our hearts were breaking as we saw what unfolded in Indiana and Arkansas. As those states stood up to defend religious liberty, and the modern Democratic Party, in a perfect storm, joined with big business to say their commitment to mandatory gay marriage in all 50 states trumps any commitment to the First Amendment. It wasn't too long ago there was bipartisan consensus on the First Amendment. We might disagree between Democrats and Republicans on marginal tax rates, but when it came to religious liberty, we stood strong. How far we have come. And let me say, Indiana was a sorting moment. As Reagan would say, a time for choosing. There are candidates running in 2016, even candidates in the Republican field, who, when Indiana was being battled, they were nowhere to be found. I can tell you this, when it comes to standing for the religious liberty of Americans, I will always, always, always stand with the First Amendment. We need to defend the Second Amendment, the right to keep America. A couple of weeks ago, we were up in New Hampshire, went to a firing range. My wife, Heidi, was at a full auto on a tripod wearing a cap that said, "Armed and Fabulous." We need to defend the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, our rights to privacy. And we need to defend the 10th Amendment. Or as President Obama calls it, the what? The fundamental protection that says the powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people. That means there are core responsibilities the federal government needs to do. It needs to defend this nation. We need to stand with the men and women of our military. We need to secure the borders. The federal government has no business being involved, and right at the top of that list is education. We need to repeal every word of Common Core. Education is is too important for it to be governed by unelected bureaucrats in Washington. It needs to be at the state level, or even better, at the local level, where we have direct control over it. And then number three, we need to restore America's leadership. For the last 6 years, we have seen the consequences of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy. Leading from behind does not work. And we cannot win a war on radical Islamic terrorism with a president who is unwilling to utter the words, radical Islamic terrorism. Instead of a president who boycotts Prime Minister Netanyahu, imagine America standing unapologetically with the nation of Israel. We saw the ugly face of Islamic terrorism in my home state of Texas. In Garland, where 2 jihadists came to commit murder. Thankfully, one police officer helped them meet their virtues. But when given the choice between free speech and the political correctness of refusing to acknowledge radical Islamic terrorism, it is a time for choosing where we stand. Just a few weeks ago, I was down in Fort Hood, where the soldiers who were shot by Nidal Hassan were finally awarded the Purple Heart. It took over 5 years for that to happen because the Obama administration refused to acknowledge that was terrorism. Instead, it was workplace violence. Now, I'll tell you the reason those Purple Hearts were awarded. I was very proud last year to introduce legislation in the Senate to mandate that the Pentagon award those Purple Hearts. Senate Armed Services Committee, we won support of Republicans and Democrats over the active opposition of the Obama Pentagon. And finally, those awards were given. I'll tell you, as I shook the hands of each soldier, as I shook the hand of each wife and child, of the 14 innocent souls who were murdered that day, all I could say to them was, I'm sorry. I'm sorry this took 5 years. This should have been acknowledged the day it happened, not 5 years too. You know, the great state of South Carolina plays a pivotal role in our nation. Y'all have the blessing and the curse of being an early primary state. So you're going to see presidential candidates descend upon you like those federal regulators and locusts. My one request is please hold back on the pesticides. But I'll tell you, the responsibility of this great state in the Republican Party is to ensure that we nominate a conservative. Because every candidate, and I don't know, there may be 15, 20, 30, 50, it may take a phone book by the end of it to tell how many candidates. But every one of them is going to say, who diddly, I'm the most conservative guy who ever lived. many speakers today who stood up here and said, I'm an establishment moderate who stands for nothing. They don't say that. So how do you tell the difference? Well, the scriptures tell us you shall know them by their fruits. And I would encourage each of you to ask every single candidate who stands up in front of you, you say you believe these principles, show me. When have you stood up and fought for them? When have you bled for them? What have you accomplished? If you say you oppose Obamacare, when have you stood up and fought to stop it? If you say you oppose President Obama's unconstitutional executive amnesty, when have you stood up and fought to stop it? If you say you support the First Amendment, where were you in Indiana? If you say you support the Second Amendment, where were you when Harry Reid and the President were coming after our gun rights? If you say you support the Fourth Amendment, our privacy, when have you stood and fought to protect it? You support the 10th Amendment, if you say you oppose Common Core, when have you stood and fought on those principles? If you say you support life and marriage, when have you stood and fought to defend life? If you say you support Israel, when have you stood and fought alongside Israel? When have you stood and fought to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons? You know, many of you may hear this and say, I agree with all this, but how can we make it happen? Let me tell you, it's not going to come from Washington. Washington is broken. I have seen it firsthand. It will only come from millions of courageous conservatives rising up to say, we want our country back. I am inspired, I am hopeful, I am optimistic because of the men and women in this room. We are building an army, a grassroots army of courageous conservatives. For each of you that have your cell phones, I want to ask you to do something. If you have your cell phones, would you pull it out and text the word Constitution to the number 33733. Let me give you that again. That's the word Constitution to 33733. The hope for this country will come from the men and women across this country like the Reagan Revolution, pulling us back. You know, it was a century and a half ago that South Carolina sent William Barrett Travis to the state of Texas. It's a century and a half ago that William Barrett Travis drew a line in the sand and said, choose where you stand. Do you stand with freedom or do you stand with death? Give me liberty or give me death. Many of y'all know my father, Pastor Cruz. My father saw freedom taken away in Cuba. I'll tell you what he said to me over and over again. I've lost my freedom once. I'll die before it happens again. I'm going to close with just telling a quick story. On January 20th, 2017, an elderly man walks up to the front gate of the White House and asks the Marine there, says, "Excuse me, sir, is Barack Obama here?" The Marine says, "I'm sorry, sir, Barack Obama is no longer President of the United States." The next day, the same elderly gentleman walks up to the gate. The same Marine is stationed there. He says, "Excuse me, sir, is Barack Obama here?" The Marine sighs and says once again, "I'm sorry, sir, Barack Obama is no longer President of the United States." The next day, the same elderly gentleman walks up to the gate. The same Marine is there again. He asks the question one more time. And this time the Marine sighs heavily and says, "Sir, I've told you 3 days in a row, Barack Obama is no longer President of the United States." And the little old man with a twinkle in his eye, he says, "I know that. I just love hearing you say it."